Here we go. Daniel Port is coming in to talk about optimized location ratios. I'm excited about this, or optimal, I should say, not optimized. But Daniel, when you get a moment, just share the PowerPoint into StreamYard and I can put it up. But Daniel, good to see you, man.
It's great to
Glad
see you as
made
well,
it.
Nick. Really just excited to be back here and to talk some location analysis and really just kind of give everyone an update on what I talked about last year. It's been really interesting to do the tests and do everything to see kind of how things turned out. So I'm excited to share with
Yeah.
everybody.
And if you guys missed it from last year, definitely go check that out on YouTube. You can watch Daniel Port's original thing. This is not time for my bagel break. I'm going to make it here today, make some lunch. Gladly, that means I can listen to all of Port's presentation. I'm going to let you take it away. And thanks so much for being here, Port, who, by the way, has been a pitcherless staffer, for 4 years now? 5?
Yeah.
Something like that. And I remember meeting you actually 2019 in Colorado.
Oh, it was the best. It was like my third week, like in Pitcherless. You're like, I'm in Denver. Do you want to go grab a beer? And I'm like, yes,
man.
absolutely.
Right around the
We ended up
corner from
talking for like 4
Sam's.
hours. Like we were pitching in the aisles of what bar we were in. And
Oh,
stuff
that's
like
right.
That.
Oh, that was really, really fun. That was cool. But anyway, Dan, take it away. It's great to see you.
Thanks so much. All right, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining me. So what we're here to do today is take an update to what I talked about last year during PitchCon, which is a new stat that I created called optimal location ratios. And, when you create a new predictive statistic, which is what last year we showed, and I'll kind of briefly go into it and its background here in a second, you need to test a predictive statistic. And that's what I took the year to do. And I'm going to talk about here today is how predictive did it turn out to be and how useful did optimal location ratios turn out to be for me in 2022. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. I'll try to keep up with them as we go through. I may end up answering a lot of them at the end, but we'll jump straight into it. And I'll kind of start with giving a brief refresher into how we got here and why we're talking about this. So way back, I believe it was in 2015, I was watching a Guardians game, and because I am from Cleveland, I'm a Guardians fan, and not a great person, but a future great pitcher, Trevor Bauer, was pitching, and he was having a rough day on the mound. He was trying to throw his curveball, which even back then was nasty, and he just couldn't get anyone to swing at it. He was walking hitters like crazy. He couldn't figure it out. You could almost see him like kind of throwing a fit on the mound because he just couldn't understand why hitters weren't swinging at the pitch. And the color commentator, I believe it was either Matt Underwood or Rick Manning, one of the two. They're kind of both the color commentators there, was talking about how the issue was that Bauer wasn't ever throwing it for a strike. And so once the hitters recognized curveball, all they needed to do was just not to swing because he couldn't put it in the zone. And so they were just laying off it like crazy. And this kind of planted the seed in my brain. I really started getting very curious about this idea. And then I started working for PitcherList a few years later. And that was right around when we all started talking about the Blake Snell blueprint, which for those of you who may be unfamiliar is the idea that you throw your four-seam fastballs up and you throw basically everything else, sinkers, breaking balls, off-speed pitches down. And this sort of started kind of connecting some dots for me because now I had the perfect places where you wanted to throw your pitches and this idea of being able to throw them in the zone enough to confuse hitters. And then about 2 years ago, I read this book called The Performance Cortex, which I really highly recommend. It's a really interesting look on neuroscience and sports and expertise and things like that. And they talked a lot about this concept of neural pathways. And it's the idea that the more you see something, the more your brain adapts to it, essentially, and creates little shortcuts in your brain. So if you see the same pitch in the same spot enough times, it doesn't bother asking you eventually to make the decision as to whether or not it's a strike. It just tells you it's going to be a ball, right? If you've seen it go out of the zone enough, it's just going to create that shortcut. And the goal of the hitter in creating those neural pathways is to save himself those milliseconds that allow him to accurately react to the ball. And if you're a pitcher, I always feel like when in doubt, your goal from like a mental standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, is to cost that hitter those milliseconds. And so that's really kind of how this all came together. And we go, if you need to throw a pitch in the zone enough times for it to be effective, and I have the spots I want you to throw it in, how often do you have to throw it in the zone for it to be effective? And out of that, OLR was born, or what we like to think of as optimal location ratios. So as we said, every pitch is an optimal location, and that this was for in order to be effective, you need to throw the pitch both inside the zone and outside the zone to prevent the establishment of those neural pathways. And my hypothesis at the time was that each pitch had this ratio or a range of ratios roughly that had a connection to pitch success. And if you want to, I've got last year's presentation on it, and I've also got I believe a primer I put out on it and a couple other articles on it that sort of explain it. I'll try to post those on my Twitter if you want. That's at Daniel J. Port, so you can kind of go back and reference those. But what I did is I tried to demonstrate its connection to p-val at the time, to show pitch success. And what I did going through that process using logistic regression, naive Bayes modeling, and decision tree modeling, I demonstrated that there was a connection between this ratio and pitch success, and also not just in terms of describing pitch success and why I was successful, but also it was predictive, that I could use it to predict future success or lack of success using this ratio. So now that we've established the statistic itself and where it came from and what we're doing with it, the question is, why do projections? And at the end of the day, in statistics, oftentimes modeling that something is predictive is different than demonstrating that it is useful. And also, for the record, that it's intuitive for making predictions, because an important distinction is when you are making predictions, you're the one making the predictions. So as you'll see in a minute, you get a projection, but it's you who makes the decision. We do this all the time in fantasy baseball or anything else. We look at ATC or streamer or any of those sort of projection models, and we make the decision on what to do with that information. And this is the same thing. Now, also part of it is OLR. So one of the bases of the predictiveness of OLR is in this naive Bayes model. And what it would tell you is, for instance, if you were looking at a four-seam fastball, I believe the number was like 54% or something like that, you would have if you're given the OLR of a pitch and nothing else, no other information about it, not even who threw it, you would have a 54% chance of correctly determining if it's going to be a positive or negative pitch by p-val for that season. And when you look at something, when you make projections, you don't just look at what you got right, but you can look at what you got wrong to see, are there other features that should be added to the model to make it more accurate? Is there other statistics I should use in conjunction with this model to help me make better predictions? That sort of thing. It also demonstrates the different ways that OLR can be used, projected, or interpreted through different means of statistical analysis. And you'll see here in a second, I actually used a couple different projection models to create my predictions. So it shows a couple different ways you can use it or interpret it. And it also helps establish the useful boundaries of OLR. As I mentioned, it's a range of ratios that we're looking at. And one of the things we talked about last year was that it can be a bit difficult to establish sort of the upper threshold, because the idea was that if you raised your OLR, your likelihood of pitch success would go up. But there is obviously an upper threshold at which if you throw it in the zone too often now, you've become predictable just in the opposite way, right? So this is a really useful way to try and establish those upper limits, is by looking at what you got right and what you got wrong here. And that can also help demonstrate and evaluate the pros and cons of the human analyst, me, making that final prediction, and where that can come in handy and where it can be a detriment as well. Now, how did I do this? So first, let's start with the many model theory. So one of the things that's really, really important to me and to a lot of statisticians is this concept called the many model theory. And it's the idea that anytime you combine multiple models that aren't, the same, aren't telling you the same thing, that aren't redundant is sort of the word that you'll see used, you're going to get a more accurate picture and more accurate information than if you used any one model in isolation by itself. If you think of, say, Ariel Cohen's really great ATC projections, I know he's here talking about it through PitchCon. Fantasy Pros does the aggregate rankings, which I really like when they rank players. Those are really great examples because they're taking different models and putting them together to give you a more accurate model. And that's sort of what I wanted to do for my projections here as well through OLR. So what I used was 3 different models to make my predictions. is what I call a naive predictive model. Uh, what it does is actually uses linear regression to make an unweighted projection based only on the data. It gives an unweighted projection, I should say, based only on the data given with no emphasis on time, proximity, or outside information. Then the second model used is what's called an autoregressive integrated moving average, or an ARIMA model. So the type of time series analysis it is, we're going to dive into it more in detail here in a second. And then the third model I did is I took an average of the two models, because one can be a little more almost aggressive, but it can be a little more future predictive, which is the ARIMA model, and the linear regression can be a little more conservative, so to say. And I wanted something that would be kind of hedge my bet between the two of them. Oftentimes, if they're going in different directions, the average can kind of keep me in check and be like, keep me from leaning in one direction or the other. So I have those three models, and hopefully that allows me to give a more accurate picture for my predictions. Now, what I would do then is for what I look at those three models, and I based off that model make a prediction of positive or negative for that pitch for that player. And it's worth noting again, I want to reiterate that these were done blind with no other information. All I did was look at these three projections, and that is it to make these predictions. And I mostly did that because the original study was done in the same way. You wouldn't use OLR in this way in sort of in the wild, in your, if you were using it, you'd have other information at your beck and call. But I wanted to really demonstrate the power and how effective this statistic was. So talk a little bit real quick about the models themselves. So for the naive prediction model, linear regression, we all are pretty familiar with it at this point. It's used a lot in sports nowadays. It is all over the place. I love it. It's great. What you usually do, and you can see here on this example, is you plot all the points, your data points, on essentially a scatter plot. And you try to draw a line, or what we call a trend line, that is the line attempting to come the closest to all of the points out there. And unfortunately, I always laugh because it's the equation for it is something we've all heard since basically like 7th or 8th grade mathematics, which is y equals mx plus b. And I feel like at some point I have to go back to all my like middle school math teachers and apologize because I always was like, we'll never use this in life. And now I use it pretty much every day, and it drives me crazy. But essentially, at the end of the day, if you're trying to make a prediction using linear regression, oftentimes the simplest way this happens is the model continues to follow the trend line and tries to make a prediction for the next data point along that trend line, right? So you can see in this example for Dean Kramer, I've got on one side his OLR number, and down the bottom, games 1 through 28 in the data set. If you're trying to predict game 29, you just draw a line continuing over, and where the line intersects with game 29, you'd make that mark, right? So that is linear regression and the naive prediction model. Now, if you go to an ARIMA model, now the ARIMA model is a type of time series analysis. Time series analysis is defined as a specific way of analyzing a sequence of data points collected over an interval of time. Essentially, you're just looking at how something has changed over time at the end of the day, right? Now, autoregression, that's what the A in ARIMA stands for, is a time series model technique that uses observations from previous time steps, or oftentimes you hear them called lag steps, as input to predict the value of the next step. Where, the thing with linear regression is it doesn't take the other data points. I mean, it does take the other data points into consideration, but it doesn't affect a data point or how it interprets a data point based on the other data, right? Whereas an ARIMA model does. It's going to look at the previous data and weight it, and then make look at the next piece that it predicts using that previous information, right? And when you look at a moving average, which is the last part there, that moving average, the MA in an ARIMA model, we see these all the time. If you follow Scott Chu, who I love, I think he's one of the smartest people in the business, and his love for rolling charts, where he'll take something like batting average or an average and show it as it moves and changes throughout the season, right? That's a moving average. A rolling chart is how you show a moving average. And it's defined as the statistic that captures the average change in a data series over time. So this is what this is going to do, is show us how an average moves, in this case OLR, how it moves and changes over a period of time, and then while giving weight to the previous information that came before it. Now, this becomes important because as you go in and you start looking at something like a moving average like this, right? What I did with the arena models, I'd tell it, okay, you take all this information and the moving average into consideration. Uh, and you can see here how this is essentially charting how Dean Kramer's final OLR in the season changed after each game, so to say, right? What I did then said, okay, now predict for me uh where his OLR will be at the end of oops, at the end of 32 games, right? So predict 32 games in the future from that last data point. Where's he going to be, right? And that's where the fun comes in. Because say this model ends at game 28, it's going to predict game 29 based on the information that came before it. And then when it goes to predict game 30, it's going to include its prediction from game 29, right? And then when it goes to do 31, it's going to include the prediction from 30 and 29, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line until I get 32 more prediction points. So it creates a lot of data and really weights all of its own predictions in and on itself. And that really can create a really powerful model and a really strong indicator of a trend. How much is the information changing over that time period? And as I mentioned, I'll then average that all together and give me my three models to work with. Right. And yes, Dean Kramer is getting a little bit of a look. It was one I was looking at for an article, and I just kind of really liked. I felt that he had really strong demonstrative visualization. So I decided to stick with that. So to jump from there into the results, right? So that's the methodology. Now, how did it go, right? How did I do? Let's start with four seam fastballs. So if you look at four seam fastballs here, I show the optimal locations you can see there. So you got the three zones at the top of the strike zone; those would be in the zone, and then that 11 and 12 are what I used for out of the zone and up, right? Now, if we look at four seam fastballs on the left here, you see the two bins sort of the data that was used to create the model. So on the right here, you see the positive, and then on the left, you see the negative. And this kind of gives you an idea of the range that we're looking for. So as you can see here, you've got that line there. That line in the middle of the box shows the median, essentially the middle of the data. And I kind of started there and kind of went a little bit for fastballs. I went up because there's so much overlap between these two boxes. So I went from 0.410 to right about 0.450, right? I'm like, I want to try and really find OLRs in that data range. And here's the funny thing, it was incredibly successful. Again, you can kind of see basically this right here is a picture of the data sheet I used over in Google Sheets. And essentially, if you're thinking I had a super sophisticated way to keep from seeing the names, no, I just basically put a sheet of paper over it and then eventually would just scroll over. I learned you could scroll over enough and then I wouldn't see the names and I could just do everything. So that is how I kept from knowing the names of the players. And I wonder at some point if I did this multiple times, if the result would be different if I just like kind of just scrambled them in different ways and kept doing it over and over and over, what the success rate would be over time. But I did 410 total predictions for the 2022 season and was highly successful. 58.3% I got correct, which is really, really great. Again, considering all I was doing was using OLR. I wasn't considering any other information. I wasn't looking at like past performance. I wasn't looking at, if you think of what we call expertise knowledge, that's what, if I knew the player's name, I could make say, look at some of these I got wrong, like Kobe Allard in here. You can see in the picture. He's right in the range of what I wanted in terms of OLR. But probably if I knew it was Kobe Allard, because I know how well I essentially knew the quality of the pitcher, I probably would have guessed differently. There's a couple of them I kept getting. It hurts my heart as a Guardians fan, but I kept getting Tristan McKenzie's numbers wrong. And it was, they were certainly ones where if I saw Tristan McKenzie's fastball, I know Tristan McKenzie's good. I've watched Tristan McKenzie pitch. I know his fastball is very good. I know he gets away with throwing it up and out of the zone a lot more often than he does in the zone. But that would be my what we call expertise data, and that wasn't applied here. So that's a very, very impressive success rate for knowing just OLR, right? And it's worth noting this success rate doesn't always translate. There were a couple I really struggled with. But like I said, what we want to do is not just look at how well I did. You don't really learn something sometimes always from getting something right. It's a question of what did I get wrong and what do we learn from that, right? So I really dove into that other, 42% or so of what I got wrong. And I separate them into false positives and false negatives, these two bins. Success, for the record, Operation Alex is just if I predicted it correctly. So if I looked and said, based on the OLR, it will be a positive. They'll have a positive p-val season, basically a 1 p-val or higher on the season. That's a success. Or if I said no, I think it's going to be a negative p-val, aka negative 1.0 or lower. I think then that is, if I guess negative, then I count that as a success as well. It's just I successfully predicted what kind of season they would have. And in case you're curious why I do between essentially 0.9 and negative 0.9, the logic being one, that's how I did the study as well when I did it last year. And the reason being, I feel like between those two numbers, right, in that range, luck plays a larger role. You can have a poor pitch and still, if you've got a great defense or if you get lucky or, you don't throw it as often, you could end up with good results in that range without it being a reflection of the quality of the pitch. So that's why I did it that way. And if one of those came up in, just binary, because really, if I want to try and look at overall, try and predict, say, a specific p-val number, I would need so many other factors. There's so many things about what makes a pitch good, right? It's velocity, it's movement, it's all of those sort of different things, spin rate, 1,000 different things. It would have been really difficult to find a connection between really anything and a specific p-val. So it's that's why we did logistic regression, which is about looking at a binary, sort of like two bins, so to say. And I kept a positive and negative when I did this. I hope that makes sense. So then I took these things I got wrong, like I said, I separated them into false positives and false negatives. Now, false positives are essentially, did I predict it would be positive and I was wrong? That turned out to be negative. And a false negative is I predicted it to be negative and it turned out to be positive. And what I found from a trend standpoint is some of that makes sense. Like velocity really, really mattered, right? And what I mean by that more is not just velocity in terms of like, do they throw 97? It's more, did their velocity change from one year to the next? If I look at, say, a pitch that was just outside of the desired range, but experienced a velocity bump. It saw a bump from 2021 to 2022 in velocity. Those pitches often subverted their projections. They would. I would look at that and say, okay, so you made a massive improvement in one of the other factors that goes into p-val, and obviously you can't always predict that, but it is something if you're like, say, looking at the beginning of a season and you're looking at a player's OLR and you see it trending up in the right way, or even as outside, but he's doing well, you can maybe say, are they experiencing a velocity bump or things like that? So this is important to note, is that typically if a player did subvert their projections in a way that would normally have caused me to say, no, that's going to be a negative p-val pitch, it ended up, I noticed they had a velocity bump in their four-seam fastball velocity. On the other hand, for false positives, that velocity either stayed the same or dropped. So that seems intuitive, but it's worth noting that if you were using OLR to make an evaluation of a player, that would be something you want to look for. For a lot of the false positives, so like I said, if I said it was going to be positive and ended up negative, active spin was lower. Now, active spin is separate but connected to spin rate. What active spin says is how much of a player's spin rate on that pitch contributes to the movement of that pitch, right? What percentage of it? And if you think of like gyro spin tends to not contribute to pitch movement. Well, I mean, it kind of does because the pitch then drops, but that's besides the point. And active spin is just saying how much of its spin creates movement, right? If the active spin was lower, that tended to be a common trend I saw amongst false positives. So again, that's another one that if you're looking at, say, a pitch you're like is right in that range you want to see, but you want to make sure you're not going to incorrectly call it positive, you might want to look at their active spin rate. And if it's higher for four-seam fastballs, that feels like a stronger positive prediction. And amongst the false negatives, mostly I saw the opposite going on. Now, if you look at the ARIMA model predictions in this, and I'll try and make all these publicly available. I'm just trying to make them prettier first. If you went by the ARIMA model results, the upper threshold pretty much ended up spot on where I was talking about, that 0.450 range. That is pretty darn spot on in terms of seeing in the visualization those box plots and then making that as an assumption to what our model predicted. That's great. There was certainly plenty of positive p-value for receivers that were above that threshold, but honestly, once you kind of got above that 0.450, it was pretty much like an even split between whether or not those pitches were positive or negative p-value pitches, which makes sense. If you throw your fastball too much in the zone, you're going to get hit. At some point, it doesn't matter if you throw 99. If you throw it in the zone up too much, a player is going to be able to predict that. Now, when you look at the linear regression model, though, that number sat much closer, about 0.430. And I think that what that means is if you're going to try and make predictions for four-seamers, one thing that would be a really useful tool is using a rolling chart to look at that moving average. And if you see a trend moving upwards towards, say, the middle of the season, suddenly it clicks and that trend starts moving up in their OLR, I'm going to bet on that a little more, right? Whereas if it seems pretty steady at that number, maybe I'm a little less confident in that number. The want to see an upward trend in that number. Now, moving from four-seam fastballs to sinkers and two-seam fastballs. Now, the optimal location for these guys is down in the zone, right? So we got that 7, 8, 9 in the zone, 13, 14 for out at the zone. And here you can see there's a bigger divide here between the positives and the negatives here. Our desired range is from 0.390 to 0.440. That's kind of the range I had set coming into this that I was going to use for these predictions. And I still did pretty darn well. 54.6% using just one statistic is pretty darn good. And again, I did this blind. I guarantee you if I was looking at, say, the names or another piece of information, like past p-val performance or something like that, that would be even higher. I did 176 total predictions because far fewer sinkers and two-seam fastballs are thrown. And you can kind of see some of them here again in that little mark down there. Some of them are kind of surprising when you're like, I know Kyle Hendricks is, and it's kind of a fun thing of like, Kyle Hendricks had a pretty rough season because he's hurt all year. His numbers were not good, but he still had a decent fastball. I mean, not great, but was a positive pitch for him. Same for like a Marcus Stroman, so some of these are really fun to look at here. But when you kind of look at what did we learn from what I got wrong? So again, I got probably 46%, 45% or so wrong. What did I learn from looking at those? When you see looking at sinkers, the biggest effect I saw was velocity. If you lost, even if you were in the right OLR range, meaning you were throwing the zone the amount I would want to see from you as a sinker thrower, when I saw that in that range and got it wrong, those sinkers showed on average a drop of over 0.6 miles per hour in velocity. So over half a mile per hour in velocity here, right? And if you look at from the median as opposed to the average, that was 0.5. So both those numbers are pretty accurate. And if you go the other way, the false negatives, the ones I was like, I don't buy that, but because they're OLR value, but they ended up with a positive p-val, they saw an increase in velocity in 2022 by over about a half mile per hour. So if you're looking at what is something that could overcome not throwing in the zone enough, velocity is one of those things that will help bridge that gap. So if you're looking at a pitch, it's like right on the threshold. If you're like, oh, so it didn't quite end up in that range that we were talking about. So like say it's at 0.37 or something. You're like, oh, it's close, but not quite there. Or, the ARIMA model says it might get up into 0.39, but the linear regression is 0.37. Go look at its velocity and then make a velocity jump. If it did, cool. I'd bet it's going to be a positive, right? And that sort of thing. Same thing, the false positives, the active spin was actually lower than the false negatives. So again, if that active spin was lower, they're getting less movement from their spin rates and things like that. That seems pretty intuitive, but worth noting. Again, that's something you can look at if you're kind of on the threshold deciding whether or not you want to give a positive or negative rating to a pitch. One thing that I want to note, and it really stood out in sinkers, but this is true almost across the board. There was very little difference for these two bins for basically the ones that got wrong in spin rate. So there really wasn't much of a difference in their spin rate that I saw. So that to me was really interesting because I expected one to be like really low and one to be really high or something like that. And there wasn't. That wasn't the case. Now, if you went by the ARIMA model, it was a little bit harder to find an upper threshold because, interestingly enough, throwing basically the upper threshold kept going up and up and up, which makes me think if you throw a lot down the zone, you get a lot of like say called strikes or probably things like that because who's going to swing at a sinker or a two seamer down in the zone? But still, you don't want to become predictive. And so for me, I still set that upper threshold somewhere around 0.430. And depending on the pitch, again, if you look at it, say its velocity or its active spin rate, I could stretch out to 0.440, 0.450, right? So that's kind of how I saw the trends kind of playing out there. And then by linear regression, that number was this kind of blew me away because usually linear regression is a little more conservative in my experience. It was shockingly much, much higher. If you were to go by linear regression, that was kind of the model you found yourself trusting more. That you could almost bump up to 0.450, 460 based on the results of 2022. It's really, really interesting. I'll be interested to see if that trend carries over into 2023 here. So moving from sinkers, we go to sliders. Now, this is funny. So if you saw my presentation last year, sliders were the strongest connection. They had the strongest connection to p-val. It was something like 67%. Like if you knew the OLR, you had a 67% probability of correctly determining whether it be a positive or negative p-val pitch. And so this was the one I expected to do the best on. I really thought I was going to just crush this one, and I didn't. I absolutely blew it. And I think I figured out why. And so this is really interesting because again, remember the exercise isn't just to like toot my own horn. Isn't to sit here and be like, look how smart I am or look how good I am. It's to say, how do we make this better? How do I interpret these results better? And that involves some failure, and that's okay. What I had set the original desired range based on those box plots was right around 0.270 to 0.380. I think with sliders, you could get away, sliders and curveballs, you'll see we can get away with throwing them down and out of the zone more often because they're so deceptive. But I only got 42% of them correct, which is wild. That's almost a 25% difference between what the 90 Bayes model said I should be doing, roughly, and what I did. And it's not 152 predictions. And I think after looking at it and really diving into it, I know what happened. So looking at sliders, the first things to kind of look at is both false positives and false negatives. Honestly, there wasn't like massive connection, it seemed like, to velocity changes or active spin rates. They were kind of all over the place for both groups. And my guess is, I'm going to guess this is probably due to how many different ways you can throw a slider. You can throw like a gyro slider, which is a much tighter slider. You can throw big looping sliders with a ton of horizontal movement. You can get into where it's almost like a slurve, like all these different things. So there's so many different ways you can throw a slider that I feel like that is partially why that is the case. What I did wrong is I assumed at some point there was an upper threshold to sliders, that essentially that there was a limit that if you threw a slider down in the zone enough, at some point you would become too predictable, right? I've said that over and over. And the 2022 data doesn't seem to imply that that's the case. If you looked at ARIMA models, the ARIMA projections, you could see consistently positive or neutral p-vals all the way up to 0.484, which, if you remember, I was looking at 0.38 as my upper threshold here. 44 is that, it's a whole, point higher than that. For the record, that 0.484 was Austin Pruitt's slider. Got 9 p-val in 2022. It's an immensely successful slider in 2022. So I'm reluctant to claim that there's no threshold, upper threshold to sliders, because obviously that can't be true. There has to be a point at which you become too predictable. That's just how we're too good at scouting. We're too good at hitting in that sense. That I can't imagine it, but I think you have a higher threshold for getting away with it, just because sliders are so good. There's so many good sliders in the league, and I think you're right that it's just a harder pitch to hit, especially since you can see a slider manifest itself in so many different ways. That I think it gets away with being located in the zone a lot more often. Um, I think tentatively, I would set that upper threshold probably something like 0.410, which again is 30 points higher than what I'd set it for this set of predictions. So I'm still a little conservative on it, and but the evidence does seem to show that there might not be this upper threshold to sliders, which is not what I would have predicted. And kind of blew my mind. I have a feeling if I went back, scrambled them up again, and did it with that in mind, I'd probably do close to that 67%. I'm almost positive I would. Now, it's also worth noting, going back to the linear progression projections, which I mentioned tend to usually be a little more conservative. They seem to indicate that upper threshold would be selling right around 410 or 420. So not as extreme as that 484, but still pretty darn high for what I would have expected it to be. So that would be the change I would make, and that would, yeah, I agree, probably somewhere between 0.400 and 0.450 is probably the right range. I totally agree. That would be probably where my adjustment for my next set of productions would be for sliders. Now, from curveballs, same locations, right? Something I want to talk about real quick with curveballs. Well, first I'll show you. This is the desired range I set. It's very similar to the slider range, which makes a lot of sense. I was much more successful here. It seemed like curveballs had a much more set upper threshold when I used it than sliders did. So I got 51.7% right, which isn't as extreme or as successful as the other pitches, but still sort of where I wanted it to be here. And then looking at the total predictions, 122 predictions, and I got like I said, 51.7% of them correct. And looking at it from here, because an interesting point on curveballs. So if you watched last year, I had actually eliminated curveballs. I didn't, I wasn't ecstatic about the results in the modeling itself. Basically, now I'm going to make this distinction. There's a statistical term called p-value, which is different than p-val. I want to find whoever called p-val, and beat the snot out of them because it's very confusing. Was up at like 47%. That meant there was a 47% chance there'd be an error in my numbers, right? For if I used curveballs with OLR. And what my suspicion at the time was because usually if you don't have a good curveball, you just don't throw a curveball. You throw a slider, you throw something else, right? And so there was the group of positive curveballs was nearly double the amount of negative curveballs, and that made it really, really difficult. And I spent all year kind of trying to figure out what to do. And finally, what I ended up selling, I was using a process we call stratification or stratified sampling. Essentially, what it is, it took our already defined populations and sampled from them with replacement. This included any repeats. So basically, what it would do is it would pull something from the sample, put it into our sample, and then put it back into the data, right? And that way you could pull something twice if you wanted to. I mean, not if you want to. If it happened randomly, it would pull from it again, right? And so for something that's much smaller than negatives, you would end up with the same amount of data, but as the positives, but there would be some repeats in there, which is a good way to make up for that divide. And then what I did is I essentially did what's called bootstrapping. I repeat the process about 1,000 times. And what that did is repeated the process 1,000 times and took the average of the sample, right? So now I suddenly had this huge, new, evenly spread out curveball data set. When I took that data set back and fed it in through the logistic regression model, it came out showing a connection now between OLR and p-val. And that was huge. I did a little dance when it came out. I did not expect that. The big news, though, was it dropped that p-value, that chance of a type 2 error in the model results, from 47% down to 6.5%. At the time, I set the goal at 5%, but it's worth noting. I think a lot of people talk about, like we'll talk about 5% as like this hard set thing. And I think a lot of people treat statistics a lot of times like there are hard set and fast rules here, right? And that's not always the case. Um, Essentially, at the end of the day, uh, you can look at it and say, as the human being using these numbers, you can say to yourself, that's honestly close enough. Uh, I'm going to keep trying and working with the model to try and get it down below 5% because it should be the goal all the time. But I think that 6.5% is close enough for us to be like, let's take a look, let's see what happened, right? And I think that that is supported in that then me getting 51.7% correct there, right? So we'll keep working to get that down throughout the year. But that was the big victory for me. I felt very, very excited to have seen that happen. Uh, so now that I fixed the model, what I learned from getting them wrong, right? So the false positives here definitely showed a velocity drop from 2021. Um, Basically, this was another one that I didn't expect because I wouldn't have expected velocity to matter for a curveball, but it certainly seemed to be with the false positives. There was some extreme drops from 3 to 4 miles an hour on them, but on average, it was close to, like a quarter of a mile an hour. By the median, it was about half a mile an hour. Uh, so velocity certainly seemed to matter when connected with OLR and its success in the zone. The false negatives, on the other hand, showed no velocity change. That was like they were very consistent in their velocity. Um, there was a really much, it wasn't so much that there was like a difference in the active spin rates for these two. What I noticed was there's a big difference between the mean and the median for these two groups. The false negatives had a much wider range. So if you think of it this way, the mean was one thing, and then the median was way different, which tends to imply that there were outliers, that there was a widespread of the data there, a wide range of that active spin rates. Whereas amongst the false negatives, there was a much higher sort of concentration of that active spin rate. So they're much closer together, and much higher in that range. There weren't a lot of low active spin rates amongst the false negatives. Um, Based on the ARIMA model, I would set the upper threshold at around 0.330. So if you look at that again, compared to where I set it, much lower, right? So, and it seems like I was being a little, I was trying to stretch it out because I did this after the sliders, and so I tried to like learn my lesson on sliders by having a lower range there, and by having a larger range, and it turns out it probably needed a lower range, and then because the interesting note was if you looked at the linear regression, they even wanted a lower maximum than that, but when you looked at linear regression, there were a ton of really positive curveballs down towards the bottom of the barrel. Right. So 0.220, we're like super low. That's the lowest number we got was a successful curveball with an incredibly low OLR. So maybe that also explains some of the separation in the numbers initially, is that whereas like we looked at sliders and wondered, is there an upper threshold for sliders? For curveballs, I kind of sit here and wonder, was there a lower threshold for sliders? And which again is I'm sorry, lower threshold for curveballs, which to me I find really fascinating. It still showed up in the ARIMA model that way, but not nearly as strongly. So I'm really intrigued to look a little further in that. It might just be the opposite, where you can kind of throw your curveball out of the zone a little more than you can your slider. And maybe the answer is you can get away with throwing your curveball in the zone less. Might be the answer as well. Now I'm starting to come up on time here. So, real quick, it looks like, before we get to our conclusions, I did want to chat real quick about, it seems like I'm missing a slide here. I apologize for that, but, for change-ups real quick. So change-ups, I got, right around 54%. And I can see if I have my numbers for that here. Nope. Okay. But I got right around 54% correct for change-ups. And change-ups were interesting because they were not very strongly connected to OLR. They were still connected to OLR, but the other pitches were much more strongly connected than changeups. And again, I think this might be because you can throw so many different types of changeups. Um, and they kind of all behave differently. There's no like one real hard set fast rule to what kind of movement or what kind of velocity you want on your changeup, or things like that. You just want that separation between your changeup and your fastball. What I noticed was the positives had a much lower spin rate. I'm just double checking that real quick so I can tell you here for sure. Yeah, so looking at it. So okay, so here's what's fascinating. So looking at velocity drops, the false positives you didn't see a huge change in velocity. What you saw was a really high set of active spin rates, which is funny because the way you throw a changeup coming off your ring finger, you would expect basically the way it comes off, you expect it to create magnus movement that would push it kind of sideways and push it down. And a lot of that would involve gyro spin, which would lower that active spin rate. So, because essentially when you get a gyro spin, the only thing that moves the ball is gravity, right? And so you wonder to a certain degree if you look at from a spin rate perspective, if you got a high spin rate like 96%, or so in there, that might be the opposite of what you're looking for out of a changeup. Because if you go over to the false negatives and you really look at it, you actually run into in here. I can actually pull this over here real quick. And you could see that. So this, the false negatives, was more in the low 90s for their spin rate, for their active spin rate, whereas this is the false positives was more in the had a median of 96, had a much higher set of spin rates. So that was one thing I looked at. So if you're looking at, because there wasn't much of a difference in the velocity changes or even in the spin rates here, you can see the mean spin rate for a false negative is a little higher, but the false positives is not. They're right around the same medians there. So really, I think what I would do if we were looking at a changeup and said, well, what did I'm kind of on the fence. I'd look at their active spin rate, and if it's too high, I'd go negative. And if it's right around that 90, I'd be willing to take a shot at being positive. So those are. Oh, sorry. I said 54. I got 51% correct on this one. So I wanted to double check that to make sure I had that out there right. And so to go back to the show to wrap things up here. Now let's talk about the conclusion. So kind of wrapping things up here. So those are all the pitches that we have. Knowing nothing about our pitches except for the OLR projections made by my models, I was able to successfully predict over 50% of the surveyed pitches with only sliders really giving me trouble. And I think we covered pretty thoroughly how I know where I went wrong there. That was more human error than the model or the statistic. I think that's easily fixable. I think I'll do much better in the future with that. I was unable to identify some places where additional information could have helped make a different decision, primarily active spin, the change in pitch's velocity from one year to the next were both really big indicators of whether or not I might be looking at a false positive or a false negative in my predictions. Expertise alone can radically change how OLR helps make decisions simply by knowing the player's name and skills. There are times where I look at I'd be grading them later because I go back and look at the p-val and that was the actual result, and I go back and like, okay, and I'd be like, oh, that's awesome. Like, be like an Austin Gomber or a big strike thrower like say an Antonio Senzatella, who is a fine pitcher, but pitches in Coors, doesn't have overwhelming stuff, and it's like, well, I would never have picked his fastball to be a positive because I know Senzatella, or something like that, those kind of things. And that I think would make a huge difference. I bet alone, the moment you start integrating that level of expertise and knowledge, all of these would get up in like the 60%, if not higher. Not to mention, if you could go back and look at their past performance, if you go back and look at their past p-vals for their pitches, look at how many they threw, what percentage of their pitch mix is that pitch. Look at movement, look at all these different things that go into whether or not a pitch is good or not. One I want to look at, and we'll talk about this in a second, is like how tall is the pitcher? Is one I think would be really fascinating to see if there's a connection between that and OLR and success. And I do think that the other conclusion we come to is multiple models do indeed help make a more informed decision as to what you want to predict. Now, going from here, what does this mean for coaches, players, scouts, and analysts? This is actually pulled from, to a certain degree, what I talked about last year, because I think this reinforces it. For coaches, these ratios and relationships could very well be useful as training models, a way to elevate a pitch that's having trouble finding success. Could help. You formulate pitching strategy if you're a catcher or a pitcher. You're working out where you want to throw and how often you want to throw it in the zone. This ratio could really help that. If you're trying to, not again to bring up Bauer, because like saying his name like makes me like feel sick a little bit. I think that you can, if you have a pitch that's nasty like he was having, and you just can't figure out why it's not working, I bet you OLR could help with that. And really help design pitch mixes and all that stuff. If you're a scout, it's a great way for seeing both, evaluating a pitcher for their control, for their sort of baseball IQ, and for pitch potential. It's the classic. I think the old saying is, if you've got two guys who can run to first base at the same speed, you take the one who doesn't have perfect form, because once you teach him perfect form, he'll be faster. It's the same thing. What if you evaluate a really great pitch that's nasty by all means, but he doesn't have a good OLR? Boom, you take that pitcher, and while everyone else might pass him up, you could pick him up and say, well, if we can just teach him to throw it in the zone more, we got a great pitcher. As analysts, obviously, we can do this to provide insight into pitcher success or lack thereof, and help us extrapolate within a reasonable margin for error if that success is going to continue, because it is predictive. So, we can start looking at, if we get into, say, the first quarter of the season, and there's a pitcher whose fastball suddenly just taken off, and you're like, why? It wasn't this before. OLR could help us look at that ratio and help predict if it'll continue, and also say, do we think it's legitimate? Do we think, that sort of thing? So I think there's a lot of really great uses for this stat, and I think going through these projections has only reinforced that beyond just the model and its results from last year. So what's next? Just to wrap things up here real quick, and I'll take questions. What's next? I'm going to make predictions again for 2023. Although this year's not going to be blind. This year I'm going to go through, and it'll take me a little bit because obviously I'm going to do a lot of research into it. But, I'm going to look at past performance. I'm going to look at PVAL. I'm going to look at the players' names. I want to see, now that we've done the blind, do we see that increase when we use it in conjunction with other stats? Because one thing I will say is, I don't believe at all in using one stat. If someone ever goes, what's the one stat you use? I go, I don't. I use 6. I believe in, again, many models. And I think that now trying to make predictions using all the other data I have at my hands in conjunction with OLR, I think I could really get good at this. And then also try and lock in all the desired ranges. Really lock in those upper thresholds, really lock in those lower thresholds. 2 years of predictions to really help me do that. I'd like to research, obviously, we saw throughout all this that active spin rate and velocity changes really seem to affect whether or not a player either overcome or did not meet their OLR numbers. I really want to kind of do some research into active spin rate and velocity changes and see how that actually affects the models, and then maybe incorporate it in the model. We just released PLV. Big, exciting. I'm really stoked to see the full range of the statistic. So I'd like to incorporate it into the model and see how that affects things. It does everything, PVAL does, and more and better. And, I think I'd love to see how that connects to it as well. I'd like to look at connection, again, I'm using it in conjunction with other stats, things like Stuff Plus for Amino Saris, or specs from the great Carlos Marcano here at Pitcher List and many other places. Look at Sierra and FIP and how they connect to OLR. As I mentioned, I'd love to look into pitcher size and arm slot and see how that affects how this works. For those of you who are real big stats nerds, I want to add one more projection in here called the Monte Carlo Markov chain. It does a really nice different set of creating a sample and then making a prediction based off of it that I think would be really useful to add another model to these models. I'm still getting I was going to try and do it for this year, but I couldn't get the coding quite down to get the results I liked. So I'm still working on that, but that'll get added in. And then pretty soon here, I'm hoping to build a public database for these projections. So, I mean, I've got the Google Sheets, but I want it to look a little prettier and be a little more intuitive for y'all. So, I hopefully will put that together pretty soon here and try and get that out for you for the public so you can look at it and probably put it in like a Tableau or something. Do something like that. So that is my presentation. That is OLR and the projections. I got a few minutes here. I don't see Nick here yet. Quite waving me off.
Hi,
There he
hey,
is.
what's going on? Yeah, guys, awesome stuff, really, Dan.
Thank you.
And I hope that we can get this on our player pages in some way, or at least host it on the
Yeah.
site in some time. I mean, it might take a moment for us to get that in the season, but
Mhm.
we got to get all of it. And I moving forward with it. I saw one question before
Yeah. By all means.
about sequencing, essentially, and what kind of your thoughts are of it from OLR.
I would love to, I feel like the sequencing is like the great pitching mystery. I feel like statistically
Yeah.
right now, where
Yes, it is.
that is what everyone wants to kind of figure out. I love to get into it. I think looking at it from an OLR standpoint, especially what I would love to look at is you do things like what's the mix of a fastball up in the
Mhm.
zone to then, is it sequencing? Can you go if you do that and then you follow it up with a fastball up and out of the zone? What is
Right.
the distance between those two pitches and its effectiveness is one that I really like to think about.
Yeah.
So it is something I certainly would love to look at. And then obviously in its conjunction to other pitches. But that's the one that, like, if I were to add to this what's next list, that is one that kind of eats at my brain, is to say, how close do those pitches have to be to still break up that neural pathway?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely there with you. I and yeah, I mean, so yeah, based on this, who is the player you have to get now this year? Let's
Oh,
hear it.
there were a couple that really stood out to me. Yeah. One I really liked, one that popped was I know Eno also talked about the end of your last session, but Ryan Nelson looked really good by a lot of
Mm,
his locations. He actually,
yeah,
which is funny because I think coming up, I can't remember if he was a command pitcher coming up or not, but he really looked good in OLR. Tristan McKenzie was the opposite, but I think by looking at how he overcame all of those because his stuff is so good, kind of almost made me buy in on him more. If that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
So those are two that really stood out to me whenever I looked through a lot of the numbers.
Awesome. Well, it's 4 o'clock, Dan. I can't thank
Yeah.
you enough for being a part of this.
Oh, my
Uh,
pleasure.
and yeah, no, it's good to see you again. Good to see
Yes,
OLR
always
once
good to see
again
you.
become a thing. And remind everybody what you do.
So yeah, I write for Pitcher List. You're gonna see a lot of OLR stuff coming out this season now that I'm thankfully done with my masters. And
Congrats.
thank you. And doing all of that, and then I do also outside of work on OLR and kind of writing in general. I have a piece coming out about standard deviations and using them in player evaluation. And then also, I host the Long Ball Legacies podcast here at Pitcher List,
That's right.
which is kind of looking at just pitchers throughout and players throughout history, and I'm creating a big list of my rankings of them, and kind of just having fun with it. And people come
Yeah.
on and talk about their favorite players and all that sort of thing. So,
Awesome, man.
yeah,
Well, given to listen, of course, on the Pitchers Podcast Network. And Dan, thanks so much for being here.
thank you so much, Nick. My pleasure.
All right, we are going to keep it going here at